We got some really great questions. So first of all, Ervin, thank you so much for the presentation. The comments that were coming in were all people saying thank you, how interested they were, how they wanted to make sure that they could view it again. They were really appreciating the information, and they asked a lot of really great follow-up questions.
Okay.
Okay, so the first one that I've got here, isn't the colonization of Rwanda by Belgium the root of the division and violence? Please respond to this Charles Darwin quote: "Wherever the European has trod death has pursued the aboriginal."
Well, actually, the genocide is very much the result of Europeans. There was, for a very long time, Tutsi dominance in Rwanda. The Tutsis have always been a small minority. At the time of the genocide in 1994, about 8% of the population, but they were dominant. They were a pastoral people, they had cause and so on. The Hutus were more agricultural. And at some point, Belgium became the colonial power there, and kind of given the power to oversee Rwanda by the League of Nations, I think. And they had the Tutsis rule in their behalf. And under Belgian overrule, the Tutsis became quite cruel. When I went to a prison in Kigali to interview prisoners there, Hutu perpetrators, the first person I talked to was a woman who was the justice minister during the genocide. And the first thing she said to me was, the reason for the genocide was slavery. The slavery of the Hutus under Tutsi rule. And the Belgians also introduced racist ideology. The Hutus, the Tutsis, in their view, and there is some truth to this, look more like Europeans. They are tall, they are actually generally better looking, although, it's only true up to a certain point. I think I could tell who is a Tutsi and who is a Hutu about 60% of the time, which leaves a lot more when I couldn't. And also, Tutsis and Hutus who believe they can always also make mistakes. There was an associate of ours, a Tutsi associate of ours, who was sure that a particular guy in our first training was a Hutu. Actually, he was a Tutsi. So, but they introduced a racist ideology that the Tutsis are genetically different, that they came from Ethiopia at some point in time. They were more like white people, and then they elevated the Tutsis to rule in their behalf. So in 1959, there was a revolution by Hutus. They overthrew the Tutsi rule, and the Belgians shifted and started to support the Hutus. And after that, there was a lot of occasional periodic Hutu violence against Tutsis. So yes, without the Belgians and without the behavior of the Belgians and without the ideology that they introduced, there probably would not have been a genocide. Very unlikely that there would have been one, because the Tutsi rule before that was quite benevolent. And actually, Hutus could become Tutsis if they are acquired a certain number of cause. So the Belgians totally changed that whole equation.
Thank you. Thank you. I believe Elise has the next question for you.
Okay. So the next question is, please comment on how current national insularism may be contributing existing social devaluation.
Well, I assume that current national insularity refers to the fact that we have been withdrawing from the rest of the world, right? You know, we used to be deeply engaged with the rest of the world. We were very important as part of the international community. We were very important in, while we were doing bad things, like various wars at various places, we were also advocating for human rights at other places. While we were supporting dictators at some places, we were supporting human rights at other places. So our presence was pretty complicated, but we were engaged, we were involved, and we withdrew from that. That itself, I don't know if that itself contributes to devaluation. It makes it easier to devalue people belonging to various groups, perhaps. You know, if we are withdrawn from the world, you know, the world doesn't matter so much to us. The tendency might be to see them in a more negative light because they are not our friends, they are not allies, or allies again anymore. And even though we withdrew, you know, their actions have some negative consequences for us in turn. But I don't know how much you can account for the devaluation of others. I mean, you know, in a way, though, it's a package by our current administration, withdrawing and derogating other groups, starting immediately when Trump was elected with Mexicans, and derogating people inside here are part and parcel of one package. So in that sense, you know, you could say that as we become more separated and distanced from other countries, and we are seen in a more negative light by them, and we see them in a more negative light, that may extend internally to certainly our minorities. And it may also extend internally to be more separated from each other. You know, in a way, it's creating, the idea is here separation. We are separating from our friends outside. We are separating from each other at home. We are diminishing the sense of connection and community everywhere.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, what type of societal infrastructures can be set up within schools to reduce violence and promote reconciliation, especially with very young children?
That's a great question. You know, there are many things that you can do in schools. First of all, work with teachers so that they treat everybody equally. Somebody did an extremely important study a good number of years ago, Robert Rosenthal. He gave kids tests in the school and told teachers that these tests show that certain particular kids are going to have a sudden intellectual growth. And at the end of the year, they found, they did give intellectual tests to kids, and at the end of the year, they found that those kids that they identified indeed did have a significant increase in their IQ. But there was no test that identified kids who would show this intellectual growth. So why did they show it? Clearly, teachers' expectations and attitudes that was affected by that information. Well, teachers carry these attitudes within themselves towards some children and not others. And that means that minority children, for example, in particular, are less likely, if the teacher holds some negative attitudes, less likely to get the same attention and the same input. Also, teachers seem to respond very negatively if a child behaves in a way that is appropriate in their culture, but the teacher doesn't understand their culture. So, for example, with Mexican American children, when a teacher admonishes them about something, they learned in such a situation not to look into the eyes of the teachers, to look down. The teachers, white teachers, tend to interpret that as a sign of resistance and hostility. And that shapes their attitudes towards that child. So teachers coming to understand their own potential prejudices, coming to understand their own ignorance and potential reactions to minority children, also coming to understand other things about themselves, like for some teacher, a child not immediately falling in line with what they say is a real affront, which is the same issue, is a problem with police officers. Somebody doesn't immediately follow what they say and they take this as something very hostile and they respond very negatively. That has to be part of police training for them to be aware of that. What are some of the things that tick them off? So teachers need to learn about themselves. That's one thing. They also need to learn what are the most positive ways to guide children, and also what are the most positive ways to create community. Now, you probably have learned about cooperative learning techniques. People realized at some point that in schools, white and black children, after desegregation, and sadly, we now have a lot of resegregation, but white and black children after desegregation tended to keep apart from each other. And black children didn't learn to their potential. So one technique that some people developed and used both as a research tool and also in schools, and I don't know how much it is schooled now, is cooperative learning techniques. So one example is that kids have a project, and each of them is supposed to learn and prepare an element of that project and then teach that part to the other kids. So each child is a teacher and each child is a learner. And using this procedure, improved interactions between minority and white children, and improved the school performance of minority children, and did not diminish the school performance of white children. So creating connection, creating opportunities for kids to deeply engage with each other, and including every child. You know, you put on a play in the school, and some kids will be actors, but other kids can do lighting and can do sets and can do all kinds of other things. So give everybody a sense of participation. With very young children, you can have plans that kids take care of. Participation in the life of the class affirms the self. Getting kids who have difficulties to participate. You know, I have talked to teachers about this again and again. And one teacher told me that there was this kid who was a little bit of a problem kid. And at some point, this teacher got this kid when early morning, some things had to be written on the blackboard for this kid to be the one who comes out and writes these things on the blackboard. And in his experience, this made a difference in the behavior of this child. Another example, they collected money in the school for charity. And there was a student who at some point stole something. And despite of his hesitation, he decided to give the job to go around and collecting the contributions from different classrooms to this kid. And he found that this really made a difference in the behavior of this kid. So what I am saying is training teachers, having teachers work with students in a different way, creating more significant interactions among children, deep connection, working for shared goals together. All of these can make a real difference in the life of the classroom and what these kids become.
Thank you. I know as I am a parent of very young children, so I both appreciate the question and the answer. And I really appreciated those examples. Thank you. We got a lot of questions related to Black Lives Matter. So I'm going to move on to one or two of those next. What is your suggestion for supporting Black Lives Matter issues and urgency now, but wanting to also apply systemic and institutional change for other disenfranchised groups experiencing prejudice, discrimination, violence directed at them? For example, Latinos or other people of color and immigrants.
Okay. I mean, one of my suggestions is basically similar to what I said before, which is to have activists approach the leadership in their community and jointly develop activities for the community. And by activists now, I mean Black Lives activists, inviting some representatives of Latino communities. You know, the discrimination, the prejudice varies only in a matter of degree and in the matter of history. I mean, you know, Latinos on the whole don't have the history of slavery, of Jim Crow, of lynchings. But I wouldn't be sure that they have not experienced some lynchings. And they have certainly experienced other ways of prejudice and discrimination. And especially in this day and age now, when ICE is looking for them and tries to get them out of the country. So going to communities, talking in an informed way about this history, not by pointing to how bad you are, but what I said earlier, talking about the suffering of people under various kinds of discrimination. You know, there is some research that shows that asking people to give up some of their privilege encounters a lot of resistance. But talking about the lack of privilege of groups that are discriminated against has more effect on those who have privilege. So pointing at you rather than look at their situation. Is that fair? Is that is that just? Trying to generate empathy is more effective. So going to the communities, trying to create community action. Also, you know, all these demonstrations, I don't know how long they can go on, but the demonstrators inviting people to join them, inviting mayors for a day to join them, inviting administrators for a day to join them, inviting police officers to join them, inviting, they mainly talk about Black Lives Matter, so inviting Hispanic groups to join them. So anyway, what am I saying? If there continue demonstrations, invite people in to join with you. Maybe sometimes stop and have a meeting and a discussion with these other people, with police officers, with government, local government officials, or even people from Congress, and join with African Americans, Black Lives Matter, join with Latinos. So there are many ways that you try to organize, but you have to use your ingenuity and you have to try also new things.
I have a question. It has to do with the readiness to act, citizens' readiness to act when facing potentially violent situations, okay? It has to do, the notion of bystandership assumes that people are educated, they know about the issue, they will know what to do to intervene, recognize the moment to act, and do it at that particular moment, okay? There is a pragmatic impediment to this, which has to do with the fact that violence is a low probability of occurrence event. Violence doesn't happen all the time. It happens very infrequently, violent behavior.
Exactly.
So how to really maintain or keep individuals' readiness to act with a behavior that is unlikely that they would ever have to face.
Right.
I think is a big challenge, and I wonder if you have something to say about that.
That's a very good point. You know, these are, in everyday life, these are quite infrequent events. And so how do you get people? Well, one way that you do it is to get them to read things that I write and read them again and again and again. But, you know, seriously, how do we, for example, include in people's experience videos of interventions, so that at least they can see it, and they remember what people might have done at various times. How do we keep it up in people's consciousness? I think it would be great to have television programs which show positive bystandership more. And maybe, we could there are filmmakers out there who are interested in good things happening. And so, create life situations that are reasonably realistic when people intervene. And again, the point in intervention is that you try first in the mildest possible way, but then, if necessary, you immediately accelerate to more intense ways. Another thing about intervention is, once a person intervenes, often others join. Now, it's even better that you invite others to be your allies. But even if not, I once saw two kids fighting and other people surrounding them, and one person had the head of the other under his arm. And I ran toward it and I shouted at the top of my voice, "Let that kid alone," something like that. And the other person just stopped and walked away. Now, I tried the same thing at another time when I saw a similar scene, a very big guy holding another guy. And this was at a mall. And I came and I screamed the same thing, and totally nothing happened. And then I tried to grab the arm of that big guy and move it away from the little guy. And I couldn't move it. I wasn't strong enough. And then other big guy came and joined, and he did it. So this is not unusual that when one bystander begins to act, then others join. Now, maybe he would have started it anyway without me. But in my experience, that makes a difference. So for people to know these things, and also know what is a mild intervention, what is a more intense intervention. And we try to get people to intervene without endangering their lives, for sure. But of course, that people sometimes do endanger their lives in order to save other people, if that is necessary. But you are right, it's a challenge, it's an issue to remind people. And, maybe in your programs, it is always worth to include something about this, that we face these situations rarely, but they are very important situations. And, some degree of kind of background preparedness for this can be very useful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
One person put in a very personal story and said, "I live in rural California where everyone in my neighborhood is a Trump supporter. They are very kind people and good neighbors with whom we have good relationships. But I don't discuss politics for fear of loss of our comfortable, if distant relationships."
Start there where I don't think that what?
They said they fear discussing politics for fear of the loss of the relationship. And her question from that is, am I a passive bystander?
As far as the issue of talking to Trump supporters when you oppose that, that's very challenging. We just don't do this in this society. And that's why I suggested that a way to do that is to ask questions. Not a question like, why are you a Trump supporter? But a question like, you know, our politics are very complicated right now. I wonder what you think about President Trump having done such and such. Yes, any kind of question can potentially affect the relationship. But the more you are able to ask a question that is not directly confrontational, these people know your political position probably, right? And if they don't, you know theirs, why shouldn't they know yours? Ask some kind of a reasonable question and follow up with another and try to get them to think about these things, asking them like, how did you feel about, you don't need to ask that first because that's a difficult question to answer, but how did you feel when at the border our government ordered for parents and children to be separated from each other? And you could even say that, even in a way that later they didn't know who was who and had difficulty reconnecting them. Try to, beforehand, you can write out a list of questions for yourself, trying to identify the ones that are milder and less confrontational. And then, depending on how the conversation goes, go on. It could be that the conversation goes that people are answering your questions, engaging with you. They may ask you questions then, which you then can answer. It could also be that the person says, I don't want to talk about this. You don't know how it would go. But if you do this right, there is some fair chance that the relationship will continue. And the fact is that, think about it, it may not be the end of the world if a particular relationship does not continue, because you have taken the chance that in a very reasonable way, you ask questions about that person's politics.
Can I interject? This is Don Meikenbaum.
Of course. This
Okay,
is a
so there is, as a clinician, the value is to ask a what question, and then follow it with a how question, and stay away from why questions. Okay? If we just go back to your instinctive response, you're asking an acknowledgement of what happened, apropos of the Mexico border. How did you come to the decision? How did that make you feel? If you ask why questions, it leads to what is called hardening of categories, and is likely to lead to reactance. So there is some value to behaviorally rehearse in some way how to engage in that kind of dialogue. So that's all I wanted to say, is that if you go back to what you just said, you started off with what questions, you followed with a how question, how it make you feel, and you stayed away from why questions.
And if I may add one thing, as somebody who's been involved in conversations like this for quite a long time, I think there is a preparation that goes into how you set up the context. If you are going to enter into the conversation to persuade them, that's a different context. If you're entering into the conversation to share your position, to affirm your humanity and your view, and to understand theirs, then you know at some point you can walk out of that not agreeing with them, not having them convince them, simply just affirming who you are in their presence. And I think we often have a very difficult time entering in conversations that seem conflictual or that seem polarizing without assuming that we somehow need to win it.
Well, yes, I mean, these are very challenging kind of situations. And now you have to walk carefully and you are taking some risk. You know, if there is maybe one last question.
My question is, maybe down the road, you could tell us about this organization that you're trying to establish as a result of this board meeting, and the way in which the Melissa Institute can help support that effort.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yes.
Right. Well, it was nice to be with you.
Thank you.
Melissa is obviously a great organization. There's very nice people in it. Goodbye to all of you, and well, we are
Stay safe.
We are in the same business, trying
Stay
to improve the world.
Yes, stay safe, but you're not getting rid of us, just so you know.
I say that again.
You are not getting rid of us. Once you join us, we'll keep you forever.
Okay. All right. Very good. Be well. Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.